What was the role of the king in the Indo-European creation myths? And what did this have to do with the fairy tale we know today as Cinderella? Well, all will be explained in this video. I'm John White and welcome to Greg and Ford. And so for those of you who are new to my videos, they have subtitles, citations in the video description and a like button which you can press for free and it will help this channel to grow. And there are also chapters in this video so you can easily skip to the sections you want to see. And with that, grab yourself a cup of tea and I shall begin. The king is dead. Long live the king. I used to be confused about what that really meant when growing up. I heard it in films occasionally. And for those of you who don't know, it refers to the king physical and the king politic. The physical king is dead, but the position of king remains and must be filled. And so through this statement, we have an understanding that the king is an important figure in societies that say such things. But was that the case in the earliest Indo-European societies? What was the role of the king? Now, as you may remember from my early videos in the Indo-European creation myth, there was Manus and Gemo, with Manus sacrificing Gemo to create the earth and the people. And so within the land and inside the people, there is a piece of Gemo. And this is highlighted when you first look at the purpose of man, and was something initially raised by Dumezil, who was a scholar in religious studies. And he had something what we call his tripartite ideology of the Indo-Europeans. And Dumezil wrote that there were three classes of men: priests, which represent magic, warriors representing war, and commoners representing the free men or food producers. But where was the king in his tripartite society? Well, as Gemo was sacrificed to provide the material to form the earth and the first person, from which all others came, it means that all people contain traces of the first man, but more importantly, the first man contains all the elements found in all three social classes. And because of this, the first man is often also considered the king. And this is highlighted by Dumezil when he states that the king has the virtues of all classes, and so is able to perform all three functions. He can practice the correct ritual as a priest, he has the courage to fight like a warrior, and he has the generosity to deliver food and resources to the free people, like a food producer. And we can see this in the roles of Yama of India, or Yima of Iran, or Ion of Greece, Romulus in Rome, and the legendary pagan king of Prussia, Wittowidi. We also see this in the roles of the sons of a king, in myths such as Vullen's saga, something I've spoken about in this video. And so, in summary, the king is a physical representation of all other classes in one. Well, nearly always, as if we head into the Persian creation myth, we see the Avestan term Zarana, a term that refers to a spirit or an essence, and this must sit within the king to provide them with the divine right to rule. And we spoke about this when talking about the flight of Yima Zanara in Yas 19, which I quote in this video here. Now, if this essence is seen as leaving the king, then the king no longer has the right to rule. And this infers the narrative that all kings need to have all elements of all the social classes within them to rule. And this is usually because they are descended from Gemo, or an equivalent, as the brother or twin of Manus. And so this need to have all parts of all classes within them defines a king's power. And so equally, if they lost some of their physical form through battle or an accident or injury, then this would mean that they physically lost part of that tripartite social representation, and then they could not be judged as being fit to be king. Now, the probably best known myth around this is the Celtic story of Nuda Aghaslau, or the Welsh hero Llathlorent, and who could be considered part of the British creation myth, which I've discussed with John Mason in this video here. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes or so. Now, the tripartite virtues were of critical importance if you wanted to become a king, but other virtues too became important as time passed, as the role evolved, including the virtue of truth, and that is a virtue that is then linked with that of honour and fame, all of which are key Indo-European virtues. And what did a king have to do to be considered truthful? Well, here we see the concept of being wed, and specifically wed to a woman who would be considered divine or a goddess. A sacred wedding was the key to delivering that virtue, as it seemed that the goddess would provide this to the king to show that he could be trusted and so would be fair to all who lived on his land. And in turn, this helps order to be maintained within his kingdom, and so within the cosmos, and this cycles to help the cosmos and the land be at one with the king. Now, this wedding would in later Indo-European cultures involve a horse ritual, and it is at this time we start seeing the horse take over from the bovine as the creature that was considered the sign of power, and so being involved in the creation of the cosmos or giving fertility to the land. And so the horse evolved into cultural rituals whereby sometimes the king or queen would have intercourse with a white mare, although not normally literally, although there are indications in some texts that suggest either directly or indirectly a dismembered phallus was involved from the horse. And this evolved into a ritual regarding the creation of the divine twins, something written about by Jan Puhvel in a book he compiled on myth and lore amongst the Indo-Europeans. And I will discuss the divine twins in another video one day, as they're different to the twins of creation, which I touch on in this video here. And so this ritual of wedding could have then evolved into a horse sacrifice, a sacrifice well evidenced and which may well have helped the evolution of the horse goddesses. A goddess who probably was not around in the early Proto Indo-European times, but now is often represented by a white horse, a horse whose name in myths can be found in Epona or Rhiannon or Equine or Gontia, amongst others. But it shows that an interesting evolution of the Indo-European culture as a horse and its influence on war and society grew, making the horse feel like a magical gift for man, a unit for war, a tool for farming, and the equivalent of a tripartite social unit, and so eventually a powerful goddess. And if you want to know more about the horse and the divine twins, leave a comment in the video below and I'll pick up on those, and if necessary I'll make a video for that. So back to the king, because we got a bit distracted. And for us, we see this king figure with these virtues hold a position of power which was often considered less than that of a priest in the early Indo-European societies. The king would seek the priest's advice before making decisions. In fact, the whole community would seek the priest's advice and help. Now, this left the king to be more of a symbolic head of the people and their culture, rather than the go-to position of knowledge and wise decisions about the future and fate. And so we can see evidence of this still being the case just 2,000 years ago in Europe, when King Macius of the Germanic tribe of the Semnoni brought his CRS, Galla, with him when visiting Rome. And Galla is mentioned by Cassius Dio briefly in his works when he says, Macias, king of the Semnones, and Galla, a virgin who was priestess in Germany, came to Domitian, and after being honoured by him, returned home. And it may have been Galla who provided evidence or stories that Tacitus then used in his book about Germania, as all this happened shortly before Tacitus wrote his book. Now, one thing we haven't touched on is the god king, as some kings were meant to be descended from gods. Surely they were considered powerful enough to be considered as such. Well, strictly speaking, Nemo, the twin of Manus, wasn't a god, and nor was his brother. And the earliest kings of the Proto Indo-Europeans were also probably not considered gods, not whilst they were alive anyway. But certain Indo-European cultures considered kings as turning into gods when they died, such as in early Mesopotamian culture, although considered divinely sanctioned to rule, such as in Rome or Egypt. And then, as beliefs evolved, then only if a king was a good king would he then be considered to be able to go to a divine realm to become a god. But this belief, as many beliefs, evolved through time, and eventually we would see kings write down their ancestors' names so as to show they were descended from a recognised god. Now, this was a really good strategy if you were a king, as few subjects lived more than a few generations, making it a hard thing to prove false with no evidence to prove otherwise. And we see this quite clearly in Anglo-Saxon kings, for example, whose 9th generation of an ancestor was often Woden. And such an example can be found in documents such as the Anglican collection xxxi and Tiberius, showing Sir Dick being descendant of Woden, although the Anglo-Saxon chronicles not only shows this being Woden, but before him it goes back to the king's ancestors being Adam, of Adam and Eve fame. Now this narrative, by some at least, of suggesting kings were gods or divine people still exists in modern times. We have an example with the Ethiopian rule in the middle of the 20th century, Haile Selassie, who was venerated as a divine person despite his protests to say he wasn't. His followers ignored him to place him at the centre of the Rastafarian religious movement. And even more oddly, there was a church in England at the end of the Second World War called the League of Christian Reformers, who considered Hitler a god. And so there seems to be a natural human disposition amongst some to place a person in power into the same realm as the gods. So what we can take from this, apart from the fact that some people are incredibly gullible, is that the position of a king was an important one and a respected one, but one that you may not have had the power that you would expect at the time of the Proto Indo-European speaking cultures and when they were around. There were people who could be considered as representative of all people and of being at one with the land. They were, by this measure, a father figure, say, of their kingdom, the political father of their people. And so, with this connection to the people and to the land, another narrative persisted, and that is what we talked about earlier. And that is when the king, or God King, lost part of his body, or his zara. He was seen as losing part of his connection with the people and literally losing control of the land, and therefore his right to rule that land. And this is shown in some narrative, in some of the mythologies about kings, especially god kings, with many tales telling that if the king loses a limb or a hand or a foot, the land suffers, plagues come, or lands are lost. Now, this doesn't also mean that if a king or a god suffers injury, that their purpose is over. I mean, look at the old Norse pantheon. Odin loses an eye, Tyr a hand, Thor his head wound, and there are other stories. They seem that, say on first examination anyway, these gods seem not to be affected by injuries, but an injured king or god is part of a common story within Indo-European mythology, and this mythology is seen in one story most know of today, but many do not realise it, and this is Cinderella. And let me explain why. It's not only the loss of an arm that was popular in these stories, but a narrative where feet became lame. Or we see more deliberate acts where gods such as Uranus is castrated by Kronos, or who himself is seen in some myths as being castrated by Zeus. And so obviously gods lose their power due to this harm, and this is seen in other stories, from the early tales of Romulus and Remus when they lived with shepherds, to within the Greek tale of Oedipus, whose grandfather was lame, and the story of Achilles and his heel, or Melampus of the Thessaly with his black foot. But these myths have more to them than just the injury. There are academics who think that this narrative hints at a far long lost initiation ritual. But whilst there may be some potential for this, the main plot we see in many of these myths is that there is an infliction placed on the key figure, the god king. They are then given a chance to prove themselves by receiving a magical gift, and then go somewhere beyond their usual boundaries to prove that they can overcome this initial infliction. And to conclude, a challenging task then happens that leads the hero, this god king, to be identified, often within a narrative of false heroes trying to take the credit instead. And as I mentioned, this is a narrative of many stories, but it can be imagined as a story where a sister is kept from the prince's ball by her stepsisters, but then magically she's gifted shoes and garments and goes to the ball. But then she loses her shoe, a reflex of the lame hero, whilst her stepsisters then say the shoe is theirs. The prince eventually finds Cinderella and she lives happily ever after, if you assume she doesn't really care for the psychological damage to the animals that were turned into people and back again. But the thing is, these myths are not just told in Indo-European lands, they're told across the Americas, in Africa. These stories probably go back into the Paleolithic age, alongside stories of the ferryman. Now, I'm not saying Cinderella was told all this time ago, it is just a story based on one told that long ago. And this notion of a hero or a king losing part of their body and so not being fit is a premise far, far older than Proto-Indo-European speakers, and so this view of a king could be much older too. Although to counter this, If there are no static societies, no cities, or more precisely kingdoms, could there really be kings? Perhaps, therefore, this story has developed from a story about a hero or a leader of a tribe. And so, to summarise all of this, the first man on earth was often considered a king, because his body contained the elements of all the social classes and the same material as which the earth was made, making him at one with the people and the land. And these kings were often considered divine, and in later Indo-European cultures were turned into gods. But the downside of this is that if the king lost that connection with the people or the land through a physical or perceived spiritual incident, then they would lose that right to be king. And so as time passed, we start to see myths and stories about things they would do to keep the power in their family. Themes such as incest and betrayal are those that are here with kings. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed that journey about kings. It really helps me out if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost anything, and I say it hopefully means this channel will grow. And in the next video, we're going to look at a question that asks a lot, and that is about Tyr from the Old Norse pantheon. And was he originally a lead god of that pantheon? And you'll be glad you watched this video first if you do watch that one. So until then, please stay safe and stay well. And this was Crack and Ford.